flawless experts who have all the answers. That's not this podcast. Instead, we chat with professionals who love what they do, have wisdom to share, and can laugh at their own mistakes. I'm Mark, and I'm the host of the WorkPlay Solutions podcast. So let's laugh, learn, and discover the joy of work. Boo, boo, boo. All right, we are back after a long gap with John Losey, organizational ecologist, advisor, facilitator, and founder of the IntoWisdom Group. And tell us some stories or folks that you've worked with where you've went through this process. Tell us a success story.
Well, here's one was their purpose was to create a healthy workplace we could be proud of. That's their purpose. Now, tell me what industry that is.
Create a health HR, or I guess. Oh yeah, I guess there's no way of knowing.
Right, because that was the two partners got together. They left a really crappy work experience. They're actually engineers, and they're used to working in a firm atmosphere, what they would call a queen bee atmosphere, where everybody serves to make the partner money, and it was really unhealthy. And so when I first talked with them, they say, John, we know what we don't want to be, but we don't know what we want to be. And so that I took their leadership through this process. And so they ended up basically, their mission was to provide research and technical services to the transportation field. But then, we went through and what happened was they started off really small, and having this playbook, they walked out with a basically 11 by 14 folded in half playbook that they would use in their meetings with their people. Everybody had that in it, where the behaviors they expected, and it created a great conversation piece. So when people question decisions, they could go back and say, how did you make this decision based on our playbook? And they could. That led them through. I was working with them for about 4 years, and it led them through several transitions. And that was a great success story, even to the point of helping the chief operating officer identify the information that he wasn't getting. He needed to get the key information to make staffing decisions and budget decisions, and he wasn't getting that data. So we worked together to identify the data he needed to fulfill the mission, the purpose, all the behaviors, but also the key themes that they were working on at that time. A lot of the work I did before the pandemic was with organizations in transition. And I worked with a church's children's program where the whole church was going through transition, and the children's program was changing the way that they were doing most everything. And they'd never had this conversation with the key leadership of the children's program. Big church, so big staff. And so we didn't do it in a weekend. I went down, I think we did 4 or 5 meetings where we worked through this game planning process. And it gave them clarity enough that they had to change. They changed some of their position and job descriptions, and they sought out different people to work as the leadership. Now, another piece of this, and I haven't had this happen, I've had people stop, but you look at, after you've done the behaviors, you've got the purpose, you've got the behaviors, and you have the mission. And you need to stop and ask, now, leaders, are you willing to live this? Are you willing to do this? Because now you guys have agreed, this is who you want to be and how you want to live. Are you willing to follow this? If you're not, then I suggest that maybe you exit. A friend of mine, one of my mentors, a guy named Fred Harburg.
You actually say that to them.
Oh yeah, that's a part of the conversation you need to have. Now, most of the time, because they're the ones who developed it, they'll buy into it. But if they were just playing along, they know that they're going to be held accountable. As a matter of fact, that one group I was working with, this was probably 8 months after we finished an update to their playbook. One of the new leaders basically left because he couldn't live it. We wanted him to be part of the conversation so he could own it, but he just played along. He didn't know that they were serious about this. And about 8 months down the road, he says, I can't do this. And they left. It was an amicable split because he was leaving because he knew he couldn't live it, and they were fine with him leaving. Those are a couple of success stories with that. And I've done bits and pieces of this in other places. I think it works best with a offsite 2-day program And it's a big piece of this is building trust and connections. So I know you may ask down the road, like one of my favorite activities when I work with corporates is building trust. One of the things that's crucial, really important in any of, like, if you get leadership together and you want to work through a strategic plan, game planning, whatever you want to call it, having ongoing trust is crucial. And that means, if you follow Lencioni at all, trust needs to precede healthy conflict. And if you want to have healthy conflict, then you have to build that trust. And one of the worst ways that I found working in this context is doing a trust fall. It goes back to, like, when I was training I was working at a camp, challenge course, ropes course, and training my facilitators. And I would hire some people who had good experience, but then I'd always hire people from different backgrounds. And one year I hired a guy who had just gotten out of the Army, his service. And he was athletic and physical and just very a deep thinker. As a staff, we started doing trust falls. And he gets up on, and because we were staff, we were doing it higher than we should. And he gets up at the top and he says, I'm doing this, but know that this doesn't mean that I trust you. I trust you not to drop me so you don't feel bad. It was very insightful. And that's when I stopped calling them trust falls. And I started calling them falling and catching, because that opened up where we can go with that. But with that particular activity has been lampooned and parodied so much that it's hard even getting through it. And if I want to get to it, I found like, you trust people who you know their stories. If you know their stories, you're going to know a little bit about what motivates them and where they come from. If you know their stories and you share purpose and mission, you don't have to like them. You know where they're coming from, and you're all aiming for the same spot. So it's not about being friends. It's about, I trust you and your experience, that we're all shooting for the same target. Now, a byproduct of that is that you may not become best friends, but you'll appreciate everybody that you're working with if you know their story and you know that you're all crystal clear on where you're shooting. What I do throughout, when I do a game planning retreat, I sprinkle these opportunities to learn each other's story throughout. And those would be like the breaks between the work. I mean, obviously we start, and I go, so I'm going to push back here. This is the first time I've said it out loud or anywhere, is that I'll push back on connection before content.
Okay.
Because if all you're given is content, send an email. It's connection before process. And whether that's process is strategic planning or it's a learning process, it's so important that we see that as we're stepping in, we need to step into any process that we're going to do with connection. And a big piece of that is telling stories. So that when we did the crowd breaker last time, where it was just asking questions, those questions are all designed to tell a story and to give a little glimpse into who I'm working with, who I'm with. So we'll do things like, at the very start, I like to do on a longer one, we'll do a thing called Creative Futures, where there's a triad, 3 people. One person they have 2 minutes to tell their story. Person A tells their story to person B and listens and asks questions. Person B then turns to person C and creates the next 10 years of their life in the best story possible. So they invent the future for this person. And it's so hilarious what comes out. And then you do a round robin until everybody has told their story, has made up a story, and listened to a story.
I want to try that in my improv class.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's straight from improv. I actually got it from another a person who influenced my perspective on creativity is a guy named Craig McNair Wilson. And he's so creative that he changes what his title or how he goes every few years. I knew him as Craig Wilson, and then he was Craig McNair Wilson. Then he was just McNair. And I don't know what he's going right now, but he worked for Disney Imagineers. And in the early 70s, he put together their kind of Imagineering creativity process. So that all the Imagineers, because Imagineers are graphic artists, engineers, architects, script writers, they're all these different fields. And what they needed was a common language or approach to the creative process. So Craig put that together. That really influenced how I think of it. And then we did some work together to adapt it into a corporate setting. And then it's the foundation to my practical creativity workshops that I do, and also how I train. I mean, for facilitators, if you want to add something to your toolkit, learn how to facilitate creativity on purpose. That's a good one. But so that's one activity. Another one is I'll send them off to interview each other and just say things like, what's your personal history? Where'd you grow up? How many siblings do you have? Where do you fall in that order? And describe a unique or interesting challenge or experience from your childhood. I've had groups, leadership teams that have been working together for 8 to 10 years that didn't know about siblings. In fact, the one group I worked with didn't even know the names of the spouses or how many kids they had. They've been working together for 8 years.
Oh.
And learning that story is a breakthrough because you start to build trust when I know your story. And we design the purpose and mission and behaviors. We design that together. I know we're all shooting at the same target, and I know both the quality of your experience, technical experience, but I know a bit about your personal history too.
Yeah, golly, I'm thinking about so many things right now. One of my aha moments, and I could be off on this belief, the number one cause of like a toxic work culture is that leaders and managers have forgotten that their employees are humans first, forgotten or don't act like they're humans who have thoughts and needs and feelings and wants and desires. And I could be naive in that thinking, but golly, you just see so much evidence of that.
I would say it's a yes and piece because they're not in business for their people. That organization is designed, and usually profit is one of the main things, but usually there's more than just profit as far as their purpose and that kind of stuff. But the organization doesn't exist for its people, but they need to realize that the people are essential and are a core part of that. You're not going to be successful if you forget that your people are human, and you're not going to be able to motivate. You're not going to be able to get, the latest thing around quiet quitting or it wasn't a great resignation, it was a great reshuffle because people realized that at one particular time, there were so many openings that they could call their shots. That's changing a little bit now. But one of the biggest things I totally agree with, because I experienced this when I worked for a big corporate, we've learned that the corporation will be loyal to fulfilling its goals and objectives. And at times that means that they've got to lay people off. And I get that. I understand that. And that it sucks for the people. I got riffed, and I could have stayed in the organization and taught people how to climb ladders. I'd rather work with people and organizations to help them get clarity. I think that that's a fundamental understanding that workers need to have, is that you cannot depend on your boss or your work to care for your needs. You can't depend on that. Now, if you are a boss or a workplace, you've got to realize if you want to keep the right people and attract the right people, you've got to tend to their needs. So it's this reciprocal responsibility of, we need to create a healthy workplace. We need to create a workplace where you're going to attract the best people, especially in the job market that we live right now. You've got to be the employer of choice to attract people. But as an employee, I don't think it's healthy for me to depend on anybody else to care for me and to care for my needs. I've got to be smart enough to have my own development plan, to seek opportunities where I need to. And also there's another direction that I go talking about how do you be effective and content in your workplace? And a big piece is dispelling the myth of work-life balance. It doesn't exist.
All right, I need to hear this.
Yeah. Well, work-life balance. Okay. When you think about balance, you think of a scale. And I think of a 3-plate scale where you have 8 chips each hour of the day. One goes to personal, one goes to work, and one goes to sleep. And it never works out that there's 8 chips. And if we're looking at balance, we're trying to keep this balance that is a myth. It doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, I think a better description is work-life tension. And especially now, it's how do you manage the tension between all the areas of your life? And tension is a positive thing. Tension can be a positive thing because it's tension that moves us forward. Balance is about static. If you're balanced, it means you're not moving anywhere. If you manage your tensions well, you're going to move into those directions, into the directions that you want to go. So nowadays it's work-life intrusion because we're working from home, we're working distance. As a matter of fact, you started working hybrid the first time you answered an email on your BlackBerry. You were working hybrid. And now work can intrude on our personal lives, and it does all the time. And our personal lives can intrude on our work. So our biggest job is to be fully present wherever we're at. And there's going to be times when we need to be fully present with our family in the middle of the 8-hour workday. There's other times that we're going to have to be fully present with our work in the middle of what should be family time. And it's managing the tension between those things that create you'll be more effective, you'll be more content if you understand how to manage yourself that way.
That's good stuff.
I used to teach a bunch of time management workshops. And you know who shows up to time management workshops? And there's people out there right now that are going, oh, John teaches or time management. I'm better than him. And those are people show up to make sure that they're still better than me. And then the other people who show up are the people whose boss told them, you got to go. And so I stopped doing that. And for a while, I didn't talk about time management. I talked about energy management, but it's even more than that. It's about self-management. It's all the aspects of yourself. And I break it into like your pace, your focus, and your energy. If you can manage those things, if you're aware of those things and can manage them, you're going to be effective and content, both in all aspects of your life, work, community, family, and you even might get enough sleep, maybe.
Tell my toddler. So let's jump into some of our fun questions we like to ask every guest. Spin the wheel of embarrassing moments. Tell us a story of professional failure where you're the one who screwed up, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, that's a big wheel because there's a lot of opportunity out there. And that's a pet peeve. Opportunity instead of failure. If you fear the word failure just is telling you where your opportunity to grow is. And so, man, cherish failures. There's a LinkedIn friend that's kind of her theme this year is exploring the power of failure and failing forward and all that stuff. But two came to mind. And one was when we first started working, I was working in a large corporate organization, and the accounting department really wanted us to focus on virtual distance learning stuff, so webinars. And I worked with some amazing curriculum designers and facilitators and trainers, great group of people. We thought, we got this. And so we jumped in with both feet to doing webinars. We had the best designers and the best facilitators doing our first set of webinars, and they were horrible. It is a great example of Dunning-Kruger effect. We thought we knew what we were doing. Well, we had no clue.
Yeah. Can you define that for folks that aren't familiar with that term?
Yeah. Dunning-Kruger effect is the tendency for people who are least skilled to think that they're the most skilled. So the thing is, if you don't think you have Dunning-Kruger effect, you probably do. And I see that come up in so many places. As a matter of fact, when the second story is about a coaching model, but I used to, within that organization afterwards, I would certify master coaches in a certain process for coaching. And our first sign that people were almost ready to become a master is when they came back and said, man, this is a huge topic. I barely got any of this, because they understood there was so much more. They added tremendously to their store of knowledge, but they realized there was so much more. When we failed miserably at webinars, we realized we need to go and take a look at what is different about webinars. And so this was back in 2009.
Wow.
And so we started realizing, we started to look at the most engaging ones. We actually took a course from one of the vendors who was providing a platform for our online content. And we just learned a ton. And it wasn't that we had to reteach our facilitators or even our designers. We just had to rethink of the context. It's like moving from teaching in a classroom of 12 to teaching outdoors in a group of 150. A lot of the same concepts, but you had to put them in a new context. And so that was like that humbling experience of, man, we don't got this. And we had to humble ourselves and go back to some of the basics. But then because we had those basics, we rapidly improved our work. So that's one. The second one was myself and a curriculum designer that we were working on the curriculum for our new supervisors. And they had a coaching approach in there that it was too milquetoast. It was just so so vague because it had to, we bought it from a vendor and it had to apply across so many different places that we decided we'd go back and create our own coaching model and unit to do it. And it was in that context that we were doing it, people latched onto it. But then we had one of the whole, like the West division, they said, we want all our people to be good coaches. I said, okay. So we brought some of their leadership in, we taught them this model, we gave them the materials, and we turned it loose. What started as ongoing conversations about performance to increase capability turned into mandatory biweekly coaching conversations that you were scored on every week. And what happened was my boss, who was the chief learning officer, came back to me and said, you know, you're not going to be able to do anything on coaching anymore. You've just lost all credibility, not because of what we put together, but because we didn't guide how it was delivered. And we didn't properly train the people who were delivering it. So they all walked out and didn't get the picture of what we were trying to teach when it came to what coaching was. So it wasn't until about 3 years later that I got connected with an outside vendor who was doing some coaching for our advanced leaders. And we pulled that into a whole enterprise-wide coaching program. But man, I definitely made sure that anybody who was going to be delivering that content truly got it. So those were the mistakes and the lessons learned there.
Love it. All right. Who is someone that has helped you or supported you in your career? What did they do? And let's thank them by name.
Yeah. Again, long list of people. And there's so many people. And I think it's important to acknowledge every single client and person that I've coached has taught me a ton, because it's reminded me of how much I don't know. I don't know their story. I don't know where they're at, but together we find clarity. And I think the person who taught me most on that front was a guy named Fred Harburg. Fred was a learning leader. He was the head of learning at Motorola when they came up with the Six Sigma thing. He was brought in to consult with Saturn when they first were formed and splintered off of GM. He's probably the least known but most influential person in the learning business. So he was actually asked by Covey, before Covey was Covey, to help him go out and start Covey. And he turned it down because he didn't want to, he was East Coast and he didn't want to move out to Utah to do that. So Fred, he taught me so many important things about how people learn and grow and how they develop. I thank him most, like the thing that I steal from him most often is a quote from, this one truly is from Mark Twain. And Mark Twain, if you don't know about him personally, Samuel Clemens smoked at one point like 80 cigars a day. Like that's a stretch goal. You got to be doing that on purpose. He swore like a sailor, but he married a Baptist Sunday school teacher. And in his later years, he made and lost several fortunes. Whenever he lost a fortune, he'd go back out on the road and do his speeches. And he was known to take a drink or two. And before he's getting up on stage, his wife saw him trying to tie a bow tie, and he was getting frustrated. And she could see he'd been drinking a little bit. He was about to erupt into a big stream of profanity. So she walked up to him and said, I'm going to show him how dumb it looks when he does that. So she steps up and says, you blankety blank blank, you blankety blank blank. And he kind of shakes his head and says, honey, you got the words, but you just ain't got the music. And that spoke to me so much about my mistake that I made with that coaching model early, is that we would teach the words. And so often what we teach, especially when we train people, we teach the words, but we don't teach the music. And the same thing goes with strategic planning. We can go through all the steps of the plan. The steps are the words. The music is your purpose and your mission and your behaviors. Those two need to go together, because the words are important, but if all you got is the words, you're going to have a hollow something that's going out there. Words and music create something spectacular. So Fred taught me about that. Another person goes back to my high school wrestling coach, a guy named Dan Pry. And I've got a long list of these, but I'll only stick with these two. So Dan Pry was my high school wrestling coach. He came in and we went from a okay wrestling team to winning a league every year. So I ended up going to college, and he moved to a school that was right next to the university I went to. So I ended up coaching freshman football with him, and I ended up coaching wrestling with him. And he ended up taking that team. The first year he was coaching up there, they went 500 in the league, to winning out the rest of the year in league and winning the league tournament. And what he taught me, I still remember, I was this guy, I was started to play college football and up there trying to coach freshmen. And I'm going, here's your first step, jab step, get a balance, all this stuff. He says, John, don't teach them how to get out of a stance until you've taught them to get into a stance. And that it's so important to remember that we need to teach and coach and lead and develop people from where they're at. There's an old adage that says, when the student is ready, the master will appear. The job of the master is knowing when to appear with what? Not everything, but whatever's next. So Fred and Dan, and I could go down the list to a bunch of others.
Love it. What's a question you haven't been asked but are burning to answer?
I'd want to explore a little bit more about the power of story. It's not just storytelling, but it leads from the stories that you tell yourself. And there's this really powerful thing about becoming aware of the stories you tell yourself, because we are notoriously bad at remembering stuff. So if there's something that's not working for you, you need to look and say, where did that obstacle come from? What is the story I'm telling myself that's keeping me from moving forward? And it's a thing, it's called, I call it story coaching, but it's looking back. If you look at your memory as a film, and the first pass at your memory of editing that film is unintentional and done in the moment for helping you survive that. So the story you tell yourself was edited back when you were dealing with other stuff. And if it's really holding you back, there's probably something in the edited story that is holding you back that you're telling yourself. So if you can go back and not reinvent the story, not make stuff up, but look at the footage on the cutting room floor. Can you re-edit that story to find a different way to deal with whatever obstacle that you're working with? So that's one kind of coaching technique. Now, word of warning is that while coaching is therapeutic, it's not therapy. And there's times if you go back and revisit that story, that something might spring up. So you've got to be ready. Anytime you're coaching, you need to be ready to refer people to counselors and therapists who are licensed, because my guess is most of us who are doing the coaching are not. So that's one thing. The bit of unwanted brain science is that well over half, and it ranges from 50 to 75% of your brain is dedicated to processing visual information. And what stories do is paint pictures in your brain. So it's an auditory way to generate that visual stimulus. And so when you tell stories, you get direct access to a person's thinking, because story and pictures, instead of when you use symbols and numbers and all that kind of stuff, there's a couple of steps interpretation your brain has to do. But if you can tell a good story, you have immediate access to a person's emotions mostly. And we know that while data convinces, stories, pictures, and emotions move people to action. So if you can tell a good story, it can't be without real factual backup. But if you can tell a good story, you're going to move people to action. You think of some of the best storytellers in history. Jesus was one of them. Mm-hmm. So when he was telling parables, he was engaging people's experience. Even though they never experienced the end before, he told stories that put them in there exactly where they were. So when he says, one of the famous lines was, "Consider the lilies of the field." Guess where everybody was standing? In the middle of fields of lilies. So immediately he turned a verbal experience, a verbal input into a picture that played off of their experience. I've worked with leaders about finding the right stories to tell. And if you're like me, or, if I know many of you guys out there learn storytelling around a campfire, and that's storytelling for entertainment. And that's a really important type of story. However, many presenters and keynoters tell stories for entertainment when they could be telling stories to further their content, to further their process and the experience that the people have. And a good story turns a presentation into an experiential activity.
I like that. For our listeners, if you want to geek out about your internal story and that narrative, check out the part A and part B with Jim Carwish on Untangled Narratives. Those are fantastic episodes. So kind of wrapping up, final thoughts, and where can people find you And it's a good time to share social media, any other things that are coming out, such as a new book.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. First of all, before I get, you can if Bear Losey on Facebook and John Losey on LinkedIn are probably the best ways to get me. You can also go to IntoWisdomGroup.com, or I just kind of started patching together a new website called picture-success.com. So those are some ways to find me. You mentioned a book, it's called Pottery Panda, and it's a business fairy tale about strategic planning that follows a raccoon who is he's on the day shift of a trash sorting business, he feels he's living too much into the stereotype of being a trash panda. It's the story of his moving into a side gig and moving that side gig into a business. And we follow an approach towards strategic planning. Because it's a story that's meant to share about strategic planning, it goes into far more detail than you would need to do, but it's just a fun story. And it's written in a form, what I call the simple book format. And what the simple book format is, instead of going long, I'm trying to go deep. So instead of creating a 250-page book that explores all the ins and outs of strategic planning and tells the story in the middle of it, I tell the story, and then at the end of each chapter, there's a QR code or a link that you can follow to the list of resources that Peter the Pottery Panda uses. And each of those turn into exercises that you can do. And, the lowest level is it turns it into an interactive PDF workbook. So if you wanted to do this for yourself, for your own business, or guide a group through it, you could use the deep part of it in order to take you there. But if you just want to read it as a story and glean some ideas about strategic planning, you can do that too.
Oh, that sounds awesome. And we'll put all of those links on the show notes. So final thoughts, what do you want to leave our listeners with?
Picture success and change on purpose.
That's good. That's good. My guest today has been John Losey, who is an organizational ecologist, advisor, facilitator, the head guru of IntoWisdom Group.
Thank you, sir.
If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a review, tell a friend, give us a gold star, or call my grandma. And if you want unforgettable events and training that's fun, like for real fun, get started today at WorkPlaySolutions.com. I know I want that.
Appreciate the break, because one of the things we know is that your brain can only absorb as much as your butt can endure.